Hello and welcome everyone to this video podcast for evolution and diversity. Over the last 3 to 4 videos, we've talked about the animals. And then in the last video podcast, we focused on the animals in the phylum Chordata. And in doing so, we talked about the lancelets, the tunicates, the lampreys, the sharks, rays, and skates, the ray-finned fish, coelacanths, lungfish, and then we started to get into the transition from sea to land. And we talked about how these lobed fins were the precursor to the limbs and how the limbs were important in order for animals to emerge from the sea to be able to walk on land. And of course, there are other adaptations that are necessary to survive on land, and we'll get to those in a little bit. And the last thing we talked about in the previous video podcast were the amphibians, the animals that first emerged from the sea to the land. And today we're going to pick up that conversation and we're going to continue to talk about the vertebrates. And we're going to begin by talking about Reptilia, which includes the lizards, snakes, turtles and tortoises, alligators, crocodiles, and birds. And then we'll also spend some time talking about mammals. And that will be in Objective 1. And in Objective 2, we're going to talk about the challenges that animals face as they moved from the sea to live on land. And then, either in this video or in class, we'll talk about the adaptations that animals had to have in order to survive on land and overcome these challenges. And then the last objective is we're going to spend a little time talking about primates and hominins. Okay, so as we begin to talk about the order of Reptilia, let's look at this phylogenetic tree and ask what adaptations did the members of Reptilia add to the chordates that are unique. And we'll see here the amniotic egg and scales with hard keratin. We'll see later on that the amniotic egg is also seen in mammals. So again, Reptilia, they added the amniotic egg and scales with keratin. And there are 4 main lineages of Reptilia. The first are the lizards and snakes. The second are the turtles and tortoises. The third are the alligators and crocodiles. And the fourth one we'll talk about are birds. So let's think about some of the characteristics associated with Reptilia. Essentially, what makes a reptile a reptile? The first thing we want to talk about is this protein called keratin. In reptiles, keratin makes up the scales that we see in reptiles like turtles, snakes, alligators, and crocodiles, or it helps make up feathers that we see in birds and the relatives of the birds, the dinosaurs. These scales and feathers that are made up of keratin helps make the skin watertight. It also adds protection. They also have the amniotic egg, and we'll talk about the amniotic egg in a few slides from now, but for now just know that these are fertilized eggs that can be developed outside of the body, or inside the body in some cases. Throughout the evolution of the chordates, the need for more efficient respiration was required. And so it's not surprising that when you look at amphibians and then you look at reptiles, that the lungs became more efficient and were much better at gas exchange. Most non-avian reptiles are ectotherms, meaning those reptiles that are not birds. And what an ectotherm is an animal that is dependent upon external sources of heat, which is why you might see a lizard or a snake either laying in the sun or avoiding the sun in order to regulate its own body temperature. Reptiles that are birds, or avian reptiles, are endotherms, and endotherms are animals that can generate their own heat internally. And as we'll learn in a little bit, mammals are also endotherms. So now let's take a closer look at these 4 groups of the phylum Reptilia. And we're going to start with snakes and lizards. And for each of these groups, we're going to talk about feeding, movement, and reproduction, and there might be a few other things we throw in here as well. Most lizards and most snakes are carnivores. However, some of the larger lizards are often herbivores. And over here to the right here, you just see a snake feeding upon a rat. Or rather, I should say, about to feed upon a rat. Okay, let's talk about movement next. Snakes and lizards can move in a variety of ways. Lizards can walk and they can run. They can swim and they can burrow. Snakes, they can also swim and they can climb and they can crawl. In regards to reproduction, snakes and lizards are most often oviparous, meaning they're laying an egg. Some of them are ovoviviparous. In almost all cases, snakes and lizards reproduce sexually. However, every now and then we can find a snake or a lizard that can reproduced parthenogenically. But even in those cases, those species usually reproduce sexually. Okay, let's talk about turtles and tortoises, some of my favorites. Most species of turtles and tortoises are omnivores, meaning that they will eat both meat and non-meat, that is vegetation or fruit. They can move in a variety of ways, including walking and swimming. In regards to reproduction, turtles and tortoises are all oviparous. They lay eggs and the young develop in those eggs outside of the body. During their reproductive seasons, some turtles and tortoises will migrate a very long distance, and they will do that repeatedly from season to season, remembering where they were the previous season. Some tortoises have lived for over 150 years. I should have probably mentioned this at the beginning, but the main difference between a turtle and a tortoise is that turtles can live on land or they can live in the water, whereas tortoises live exclusively on land. Okay, let's talk about crocodiles and alligators. All crocodiles and all alligators are carnivores. In their movement, they can either walk or they can swim. I should have included that they can also run. I've always been told if a crocodile or alligator is chasing you, that you should run in a zigzag pattern because they have a hard time running in a zigzag pattern. Fortunately, I've never had to test that theory out. In regards to reproduction, all alligators and crocodiles are oviparous, and they show a fair amount of parental care. Unlike the turtles, who leave their eggs behind after they lay them, crocodiles and alligators will guard and protect their egg nests. So if you're curious about the difference between alligators and crocodiles, here are a few differences. As you see here, the bottom here is an alligator. It has a much more rounded nose, whereas the crocodile, and it's hard to see in this picture here, but it has a much more V-shaped nose. Alligators are found in freshwater, and they're the ones that we would find in the United States as well as other parts of the world. Crocodiles can be found in freshwater, but they can also be found in saltwater. Alligators tend to be a little smaller, but certainly not small, but tend to be a little smaller than crocodiles and are more docile. They typically are not dangerous to humans unless they or their eggs are threatened. Crocodiles tend to be larger and much more aggressive. Okay, let's talk about the group of reptiles that we call birds. Birds tend to be carnivores or herbivores, and you can often tell a lot about a bird's diet by looking and comparing the shape of its beak. And we talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the semester when we talked about the finches found on the Galapagos Islands and how the shape of the beaks were adaptations that allowed certain populations of finches to survive. Depending on the species of bird, they can fly, they can glide, they can also swim, like we see with the penguins, and they can also run. As you know, not all birds fly. For instance, the penguin doesn't fly, the ostrich doesn't fly, nor does the emu. So there is a wide variety of movement patterns found in birds. Birds are also oviparous, and they show extensive parental care, more so than any of the other reptiles, or really any of the other chordates that we've talked about. I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about birds and talk about their ability to fly. Remember, as I said at the beginning of this video, the feathers are composed of keratin, and they are essentially just this outgrowth from the skin. So the structures of wings and the ability to fly are not homologous. They have evolved 3 different times throughout evolution. Today we see them in the birds and the bats, but we also see them in the pterosaurs, which were dinosaurs that are extinct now. It's also important to remember that birds and dinosaurs are in the same monophyletic group. Essentially what I'm saying here is that birds are dinosaurs. That is always an interesting thing for me to think about, because when I was taught this subject in college and in high school, we did not think that birds were in the group of reptiles, and we certainly didn't think they were dinosaurs. So that's just a great example of how science changes based upon new evidence. And a lot of this new evidence has come from having a much better understanding of the genetic systems within birds and dinosaurs and all of life. So because of that, we know that dinosaurs had feathers. At least many of them did. Now most dinosaurs could not fly, but the non-flying dinosaurs probably used these feathers for insulation and mating purposes. Now through the course of evolution, several adaptations helped increase the efficiency of flight. As birds evolved, they became much smaller, and thus less energy to keep them in the air. Linked to that, they became lighter. This also made flying more efficient. They became lighter mainly because of their skeleton system. They have fewer bones. The bones they have thin walls, and they are hollow. Now, the non-avian reptiles and the avian reptiles, as well as mammals, have a sternum. That's that bone right at the center of your rib cage. On birds, there's a structure on the sternum called a keel. And this keel is really important because it allows the attachment of muscles that are used for flight. And this allows those muscles to become bigger and stronger, and were able to be used with much greater force. And finally, birds are endothermic, as we've mentioned before. This helps sustain their activity year-round. Okay, we're about to leave the reptiles behind for now and move towards mammals. But before we do that, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this amniotic egg, which is something that both mammals and reptiles have. So with that in mind, are reptiles more related to mammals or amphibians? And because mammals and reptiles share a more recent common ancestor here at this ancestor here that had the amniotic egg than they shared a common ancestor with amphibians here, we would say that reptiles are more related to mammals than they are to amphibians. So let's talk about this amniotic egg. When we talked about the amphibians, we mentioned that they have to live near water because that is where they lay their eggs. And if they didn't do that, the eggs would dry up. Because of that, it's really important that the habitat for amphibians is near fresh water. And we see that here in this picture right here with these frog eggs. So it was incredibly important that reptiles and mammals have an adaptation that allowed them to move further away from water so that their eggs would not dry out. And the adaptation was this amniotic egg. And so we see this in oviparous reptiles, meaning the reptiles that lay eggs, which is most of them, and the few mammals that also lay eggs. They have what we call an amniotic egg. So here are some eggs from a bird's nest, and these are eggs in a turtle nest. So let's talk a little bit about the amniotic egg. The amniotic egg has 4 membranes. The first is the amnion. And the amnion, shown here in blue, is what surrounds the developing embryo and contains fluid within it that also will protect the embryo. The yolk sac, shown here in yellow. This is important because it helps provide nutrients for the developing embryo. The allantois, shown here in the orange. This is where wastes are collected so that the embryo, as it's developing, isn't swimming around in its own waste products. And the last one here is the chorion, and it's this red membrane surrounding the other 3 membranes. And the chorion is important for gas exchange. I didn't list it here, but the albumin here, it's not a membrane, but it's also really important. This is the part of the egg that provides water and is a mechanical support for the egg. It helps protect the egg as it's developing. Now, depending on the kind of animal we're talking about, the outside of the egg can be quite different. That shell of the egg for lizards and snakes tends to be leathery. In turtles, crocodiles, alligators, and birds, it becomes more rigid with a calcium carbonate shell. And since most mammals are viviparous, meaning the young develop within the parent, they don't have the shell, but they will have these 4 membranes. So let's list a few advantages of the amniotic egg. It provides mechanical support and protection for the developing embryo. The egg also provides a greater surface area that allows for a greater amount of gas exchange. And the larger the surface area is, the larger and more independent the progeny can be when it hatches. All right, let's go ahead and move towards the mammals. And remember, the mammals are going to have this amniotic egg, but they're not going to have scales and the hard keratin that we see in reptiles. Rather, the mammals are going to have fur instead of the scales and hard keratin, but fur is still made out of keratin. It just has taken on a different adaptation. It has just taken on a different form. The other thing that mammals have, the other things that mammals do that reptiles don't, is that they have lactation. So let's talk about these 2 synapomorphies in a little bit more detail. Let's start with lactation. Only mammals have mammary glands, and these mammary glands produce milk that the young can feed off of. And so this process of producing milk is called lactation. In addition to the lactation synapomorphy, mammals also had to have the adaptation to feed upon that milk. And these include having cheek muscles and lips that enabled suckling the milk. The second important synapomorphy is fur. Now, fur comes from keratin, and so keratin itself isn't a synapomorphy because we see keratin in reptiles. It's just that in mammals, instead of forming a hard scale or feathers, keratin forms a much different structure, and that is in the form of fur or hair. The purpose of fur and hair is similar to that we see with the scales and the feathers. It helps keep water from the skin, and it provides an insulation to the animal. It also provides some protection and aids in camouflage. All right, now I would like to talk about the placenta. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the amniotic egg again. And viviparous mammals also have that amniotic egg with those same four membranes, the chorion, the amnion, and the yolk sac. You don't see the atlantois here because the atlantois, along with the chorion, forms the placenta. And so let's talk about the placenta a little bit more. Since the young are developing inside of the mother, there has to be a more efficient way to deliver nutrients to the developing embryo. You don't need a big yolk sac for those nutrients. Instead, the mother is going to provide the nutrients through the placenta. Placenta is considered an organ in mammals that brings together the blood vessels of the embryo and the mother, and this allows for the exchange of nutrients and gases. It's important to remember that there's not actual mixing of fetal and maternal blood, but the vessels intertwine with each other, allowing for the exchange of gas between moms and embryos' blood vessels. As I said earlier, this placenta is formed from the chorion and the atlantois. So what are some of the advantages of the placenta? The first is that it provides a constant and favorable temperature. Depending on the species, mom is going to have a consistent temperature because mammals are endotherms. And so this provides the constant temperature for the developing embryo. The placenta also protects the embryo as it's developing. And the last thing is that this makes the developing embryo portable. Wherever mom goes, the embryo goes with her. And so this also provides protection because mom doesn't have to leave her eggs behind. So let's go ahead and begin our discussion of the three groups of mammals. The three groups of mammals are the monotremes, which we often call the egg-laying mammals. Marsupials, they're known for carrying their young in their pouches like we see in this kangaroo here. And then the placental mammals, like you and me. And placental mammals nourish their young in the uterus. Let's talk about the monotremes first, the egg-laying mammals. The two best examples are the platypus and the echidnas. Let's talk about their feeding, movement, and reproduction. Monotremes are carnivores. In the water, they swim, like you see this duckbill platypus here, but they can also walk on land. Aiding in their swimming are their webbed feet. They're the only mammals that are oviparous. That is, they are the only mammals that lay eggs. So let's move to the second group, the marsupials. And remember, these are the ones that carry their young in pouches. And some examples here are the kangaroos, shown here, the koala bears, shown here, the wallabies, which aren't shown here, but they look similar to the kangaroos, the opossums, shown here, and the Tasmanian devil, shown here. Most of these we find in Australia and the islands around Australia, except for the opossums, where we see in other parts of the world, including North America. So as I said before, marsupials carry their young in pouches. Depending on the species you're talking about, they can be carnivores, omnivores, or herbivores. They have a variety of ways to move depending upon the species. They can crawl, they can glide, they can walk, they can run, they can hop. In regards to reproduction, marsupials are viviparous. The young still develop inside of the egg, and they develop with a very simple placenta. However, they don't develop to full maturity until they leave the placenta and they crawl towards the pouch where they complete their development inside of that pouch, feeding upon the milk that the mom provides. Okay, let's move to our last group of mammals, the Eutheria, which we often call the placental mammals. These include a wide variety of mammals, including rodents, bats, primates, hippos, dogs, humans. In fact, most mammals are placental mammals. Like the marsupials, the feeding patterns of placental mammals is quite varied depending upon the species. They can be carnivores, they can be herbivores, or they can be omnivores. You can tell a lot about whether they're carnivores, herbivores, or omnivores by examining their teeth and digestive tract, because those two things will correlate with their diet. Movement is also quite varied, as you might expect. Walking, running, burrowing, gliding, flying, swinging, swimming, just about anything you can think of, depending upon the species. Like the marsupials, the placental mammals are also viviparous. They have a much more developed and extensive placenta because the young are going to stay inside of the mother until birth. So they have to have a more extensive placenta in order to provide the nutrients necessary. They will have a much longer pregnancy with this internal development. Compared to marsupials, the young when they are born are highly developed. However, even though they are quite developed, parental care is still extremely high within the placental mammals. So let's close our discussion of the chordates by just a simple comparison of the number of species we see in each of the phylum. And you don't need to memorize the relative order of the number of species in each of these phylum. But what I would like you to remember is that the ray-finned fish make up the most number of species amongst all the chordates. And then you should also know that the reptiles, turtles, snakes, lizards, crocodiles, alligators, and birds make up the second most number of species within Chordata. Okay, let's move on to this next objective. And that is to have a brief discussion here of some of the challenges animals faced as they move from sea to land. Let's go ahead and make a list here of challenges that animals faced as they moved to a life on land. And as we look at this list, it may look similar to the same challenges that plants faced as they moved from the sea to land. So to survive on land, animals had to acquire water because they weren't living in water, and as they evolved further, they weren't necessarily living near water either. Linked to that, how are the animals going to keep from drying out? Just like the plants, the animals as they emerged from the sea, were going to be much more in danger of the damaging effects of UV radiation. The fourth one here is gravity. They had to have a way to battle against gravity and support their body and move. Gas exchange. Gas exchange had to evolve because the concentration of the gases were different on land versus the concentration of gases in the sea. As animals transitioned to land, they had to adapt ways to Okay, that is all I have for this video podcast. If you have any questions at all, please make sure you let me know. If not, I will see you in class. Bye for now.
Sheldon, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm gonna miss you.
Yeah, please, Penny. As you know, I'm not comfortable with prolonged goodbyes and maudlin displays of emotion, so I prepared a short video. Greetings. As you know, I'm not comfortable with prolonged goodbyes and maudlin displays of emotion, so I prepared this short video. The four of you are three of my closest friends and one treasured acquaintance. Though I cannot state categorically that my life will be diminished by not having you in it, I am comfortable if you choose to believe that. Since you intend to remain in this lawless metropolitan area, statistics suggest that you will succumb to tragic and gruesome ends before we meet again. Live long and prosper.
Sheldon, that's so...
You might want to lock the door behind me. This isn't Bozeman.